Sometimes the hardest thing about losing someone you love isn't the funeral or the flowers, it's the moment you realize you have to keep living without them. Ben Carver knew that feeling all too well as he stared at the rundown farm his late wife had left him. Everyone said the place was worthless, the house was falling apart, weeds covered the fields, and his brother-in-law wouldn't stop reminding him what a mistake this was. Even the neighbors whispered when they saw him in town with his 2 kids shopping at the thrift store. But sometimes what looks like the end is really just the beginning. Hidden in that old farmhouse was a secret worth $143 million. A secret that would change everything Ben thought he knew about his wife's family. What did her grandfather hide in that dusty attic all those years ago? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The gravel crunched under the tires of Ben's pickup truck as he pulled into what had once been a circular driveway. Now it was more like a suggestion of a path, with weeds pushing through cracks and potholes deep enough to swallow a tire. He turned off the engine and sat for a moment, his hands still gripping the steering wheel, listening to the silence that felt heavier than any sound. Sarah, 14 and trying hard to look like none of this bothered her, stared out the passenger window at the farmhouse. Her dark hair fell across her face like a curtain she could hide behind. In the back seat, 11-year-old Jake pressed his nose against the glass, his breath fogging up the window as he took in their new home. "It's bigger than I thought it would be," Jake said, and Ben could hear him trying to find something positive to say. The house was bigger, Ben had to give him that. 3 stories of what had once been white clapboard siding, now weathered to a tired grey. The wraparound porch sagged in the middle like an old man's back, and several of the spindles that held up the railing had given up entirely. Green shutters hung at odd angles, and one of the upstairs windows was boarded up with plywood that had seen better decades. "Mom always said it was beautiful," Sarah said quietly, and Ben's chest tightened at the way she still spoke about Emma, in present tense sometimes. Emma had talked about this place with a mix of love and sadness that Ben had never quite understood. She'd grown up here until she was 8, when her parents moved to town after her grandfather died. The way she told it, her grandfather had been the heart of this place, and when he was gone, the farm just seemed to lose its purpose. "Your mom was right," Ben said, opening his truck door. "It's got good bones, just needs some care." They climbed out into the September afternoon, and Ben was surprised by how quiet it was. No traffic sounds, no neighbors mowing lawns or kids playing in nearby yards. Just the whisper of wind through the oak trees that lined the property and the distant sound of water moving somewhere beyond the fields. The land stretched out in all directions, maybe 40 acres total, though it was hard to tell where their property ended and the neighboring farms began. What had once been cultivated fields was now a tangle of volunteer wheat, wild grasses and brambles that reached as high as Ben's waist in some places. A red barn sat about 100 yards from the house, its roof missing shingles and its doors hanging open like a mouth caught in surprise. Jake ran ahead to the porch steps, testing each one carefully before putting his full weight on it. "Dad, come look at this," he called, pointing to something carved into one of the porch posts. Ben walked over and saw what had caught Jake's attention. Someone had carved initials into the wood, EM plus JR, with a heart around them, and the year 1952 underneath. "That's your mum's grandparents," Ben said, running his finger over the carved letters. "Emil and Janet. Emma used to tell me stories about them." Sarah joined them on the porch, and for a moment they all stood looking at those initials, thinking about the young couple who had carved them there 70 years ago, full of hope and plans for their future together. The front door was painted green, though most of the paint had peeled away to show the bare wood underneath. Ben had the key that Emma's lawyer had given him, but when he tried the handle, the door swung open with a long creak that sounded like the house itself was sighing. The inside smelled like dust and thyme and something else that Ben couldn't quite place, something botanical, like dried flowers or old herbs. The afternoon light filtered through dirty windows, casting everything in a golden haze that made the dust motes dance in the air. The front room was larger than Ben had expected, with hardwood floors that needed refinishing and walls covered in faded floral wallpaper. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, its mantel covered in what looked like 40 years of accumulated dust. Furniture sat covered in white sheets like ghosts waiting to be awakened. "It's like a museum," Sarah said, and Ben could hear the wonder in her voice despite herself. They moved through the house slowly, each room revealing more of the life that Emma's family had built here. The kitchen still had the original cabinets, painted yellow with glass doors that showed dishes and glassware left exactly where they'd been placed decades ago. An old Frigidaire hummed in the corner, somehow still running after all these years. Jake discovered a pantry behind the kitchen that was bigger than most modern bedrooms, its shelves lined with mason jars full of preserves that had long since gone bad. "Look at all this stuff," he called, his voice echoing in the small space. "There must be 100 jars in here." Ben peered into the pantry and saw what Jake meant. The shelves were packed with canned goods, preserves, and what looked like dried herbs and seeds in smaller jars. Labels written in careful script identified everything. Tomatoes, 1,979. Green beans, 1,981. Elderberry jelly, 1,983. Emma's grandmother was quite the gardener, Ben said, remembering the stories Emma had told him about Janet's legendary vegetable garden and her skill with preserving the harvest. Upstairs, they found 4 bedrooms, each one frozen in time like a photograph. The master bedroom still had clothes hanging in the closet, and the bed was made with a quilt that looked hand-stitched. Sarah claimed the room that had been Emma's when she was little, recognizing it from her mother's descriptions. The walls were still painted pale pink, and there was a window seat that looked out over what had once been the garden. Jake chose the room next to Sarah's, drawn by the fact that it had 2 windows and what appeared to be a secret compartment built into the wall behind a loose board. The 3rd floor was mostly attic space, low and cramped under the eaves, filled with trunks and boxes and furniture that hadn't been used in decades. Ben made a mental note to explore it properly later, when they'd had time to settle in. As the afternoon wore on, they made trip after trip to the truck, carrying in their belongings and trying to figure out where everything would go. Ben had sold most of their furniture before the move, keeping only what would fit in the truck and what held the most sentimental value. It didn't take long to realize that this house could swallow their possessions without even noticing. By dinner time, they had managed to clear out and clean 1 bedroom for Ben and set up air mattresses for the kids in their chosen rooms. The kitchen was functional once Ben figured out how to get the old gas stove to work. And they ate dinner off paper plates while sitting at the kitchen table that had probably been there since the 1950s. "So, what do you think?" Ben asked as they finished eating. Jake was already making plans. "I want to explore the barn tomorrow, and I saw what looked like a creek back behind those trees." Sarah was more cautious. "It's going to take a lot of work to make this place livable," she said, but Ben could hear the possibility in her voice. After dinner, they sat on the front porch and watched the sun set over the fields. The sky turned brilliant orange and pink, and Ben understood for the first time why Emma had always talked about the sunsets here with such reverence. As darkness fell, the sounds of the countryside emerged. Crickets and tree frogs created a symphony that was foreign to kids who had grown up in the suburbs. An owl called from somewhere in the oak trees, and something rustled in the tall grass at the edge of the yard. "It's so quiet," Sarah said, and Ben wasn't sure if she meant it as a complaint or an observation. "Different kind of quiet than the city," Ben agreed. "Emma always said this place had a way of making you slow down and think." They went inside when the mosquitoes got too persistent, and Ben spent the evening trying to get the hot water heater working while the kids explored more of the house. He could hear them upstairs, opening closets and drawers, discovering the remnants of lives lived and left behind. When he finally got the kids settled for the night, Ben walked back downstairs and stood in the living room, trying to imagine Emma as a little girl running through these rooms. She had always spoken about her grandfather with such love and admiration, describing him as a man who could make anything grow and who saw magic in the simplest things. According to Emma, her grandfather Emil had been ahead of his time when it came to sustainable farming and soil conservation. He had experimented with crop rotation and natural pest control long before those practices became mainstream. The other farmers in the area had thought he was eccentric, maybe even a little crazy, but Emma remembered his fields always producing more than anyone else's. Ben walked to the kitchen window and looked out at the moonlit fields, trying to see what Emil had seen in this land. All he could make out were the shadows of overgrown weeds and the dark silhouette of the barn against the night sky. Tomorrow he would start the real work of making this place home. He would need to find a job, get the kids enrolled in school, and begin the overwhelming task of bringing the house back to life. But tonight, standing in Emma's childhood home with his children sleeping upstairs, Ben felt something he hadn't experienced since Emma's death 6 months ago. It wasn't quite hope yet, but it was the possibility of hope. He thought about Emma's stories of her grandfather and wondered what Emil would think of Ben's decision to move here. Would he approve of this city man trying to make a go of it on the land that Emil had loved so much? Or would he see Ben as just another dreamer destined to fail? As Ben turned off the lights and headed upstairs, he made a silent promise to Emma's memory. He would make this work, somehow. He would give their children the kind of childhood Emma had cherished here, full of space and possibility, and the kind of peace that only comes from being connected to the land. He didn't know yet about the leather satchel hidden in the attic, or the secrets it contained. He didn't know that Emil's experiments had produced something far more valuable than anyone could have imagined. All he knew was that this felt like the right place to start over, and sometimes that was enough. 3 days into their new life at the farm, Ben was beginning to understand why Emma's parents had eventually given up on the place. Everything that could break had broken, and everything that could leak was leaking. The roof had at least 6 places where rain came through. The plumbing made sounds like angry ghosts, and the electrical system seemed to have been installed sometime during the Coolidge administration. Ben had spent the morning trying to fix a window that wouldn't stay open in what had been Emil's study, a small room off the living room that was lined floor to ceiling with books about agriculture, botany, and soil science. Most of the books were old, their spines cracked and pages yellowed, but they had been carefully maintained and organized. Sarah had found Emma's childhood journal the day before, tucked away in the window seat of her new bedroom. She'd been reading passages aloud at breakfast, delighting in her mother's descriptions of life on the farm. "Listen to this," she had said, adjusting her glasses. "July 15th, 1985. Grandpa showed me his special plants today. He says they're magic because they can grow even when it doesn't rain. I helped him water them in the secret garden behind the barn. He made me promise not to tell anyone because people wouldn't understand." Ben had smiled at that, thinking it was exactly the kind of thing a grandfather would tell an 8-year-old to make gardening seem more exciting. Now, wrestling with the stubborn window in Emil's study, he was starting to think there might have been more truth to Emma's childhood stories than he'd realized. The window finally gave way with a screech of protest, and fresh air flooded into the stuffy room. As Ben stepped back, his foot caught on something, and he looked down to see a loose floorboard that had popped up slightly. He knelt down and worked his fingers under the edge of the board, lifting it to reveal a small cavity underneath. His heart skipped when he saw what was hidden there. A leather satchel, old and worn but still intact, lay nestled in the space between the floor joists. Ben lifted it out carefully, surprised by its weight. The leather was soft with age, and the brass buckles had turned green with patina. Stamped into the leather near the top was a name, Dr. Emils Research, and underneath it, Agricultural Research, 1934. Ben's hands trembled slightly as he unbuckled the satchel and looked inside. The contents were carefully organized and protected in oiled cloth wrapping. There were hand-drawn maps of the property, showing areas that Ben didn't recognize from his explorations. Detailed botanical drawings filled a leather-bound notebook, each page covered with careful observations written in a precise hand. Small glass vials contained dried plant specimens, each one labeled with what appeared to be hybrid designations. Dr. 7, ex-Turkestan, drought-resistant strain 23. Soil regenerative hybrid A12. There were pressed flowers and leaves that Ben had never seen before, and photographs of plants growing in conditions that looked impossible, thriving green crops in what appeared to be drought-stricken fields. But it was the letters that made Ben's pulse quicken. Correspondence with agricultural colleges, seed companies, and government agricultural departments, all dated from the 1930s and early 1940s. The letters spoke of revolutionary developments in drought-resistant crops, of plants that could not only survive in poor soil, but actually improve it, of agricultural innovations that could change farming forever. "Dad," Jake's voice came from the doorway, making Ben jump. "What's that?" Before Ben could answer, Sarah appeared beside her brother, drawn by the same curiosity. Both children stared at the satchel, and its contents spread across Emil's desk. "I think," Ben said slowly, "this belonged to your great-great-grandfather. It was hidden under the floorboards." Sarah picked up one of the botanical drawings, studying it with the same intensity she brought to her advanced biology classes. "Dad, look at this. These aren't normal plant diagrams. See how he's marked the root systems? And these notes about soil pH and nitrogen fixation, this is really advanced stuff." Jake was more interested in the maps. "Look, there are X's marked all over the property. And what's this area behind the barn that's shaded in?" Ben looked at the map Jake was holding and saw what appeared to be a detailed survey of the farm, with specific areas marked for different types of experiments. The shaded area behind the barn was labeled Primary Test Site Restricted Access. "We should go look," Jake said, already heading for the door. "Wait," Ben called after him. "Let me look through this stuff first. There might be important information we need to understand." But even as he said it, Ben was feeling the same pull of curiosity that had grabbed his son. Here was evidence that Emil hadn't just been an eccentric farmer, he had been conducting serious scientific research. The kind of research that agricultural companies and universities had been interested in. Sarah was reading through one of the letters, her eyes growing wider with each line. "Dad, listen to this. It's from the University of California at Davis, dated 1941. Dear Dr. Reeves, we are most interested in your reports of crop yields exceeding 300% of regional averages during drought conditions. We would very much like to arrange a visit to observe your methods firsthand." Ben took the letter from her and read it himself. It was signed by someone with the title Director of Agricultural Research and had the formal letterhead of the university. This wasn't the correspondence of a hobby gardener, this was serious academic interest. He picked up another letter, this one from the U.S. Department of Agriculture. "Dr. Reeves, your preliminary reports suggest developments that could be of significant national importance, particularly given current global food security concerns. We are prepared to offer substantial funding for expanded trials of your drought-resistant varieties." "Why didn't anyone know about this?" Sarah asked. "If Grandpa Emil was doing such important work, why did everyone think he was just a strange old farmer?" Ben was wondering the same thing. He continued reading through the correspondence, and slowly a picture began to emerge. The letters started enthusiastic and encouraging, but the tone changed over time. Later, letters became more cautious, then skeptical, then finally dismissive. A letter from 1943 spoke of irregularities in reported data and inability to replicate results. Another from 1944 mentioned concerns about scientific methodology and suggested that Emil's claims were inconsistent with established agricultural science. The final letter in the collection, dated 1945, was brutal in its rejection. After extensive review, we must conclude that Dr. Reeves' alleged discoveries cannot be substantiated through proper scientific channels. We recommend ceasing all research collaboration and suggest that future claims be subjected to independent verification before publication. They didn't believe him, Ben said, more to himself than to the children. Or maybe, Sarah said quietly, they had reasons not to want to believe him. Before Ben could ask what she meant, they heard the sound of a car pulling into the driveway. Through the window, Ben saw his brother-in-law Rick climbing out of his new pickup truck, his face already set in the expression of disapproval that had become familiar over the past few months. "Hide this stuff," Ben said quickly, gathering up the papers and maps. "Don't mention it to Rick." "Why not?" Jake asked. "Because," Ben said, remembering Rick's constant pressure to sell the farm, "some things are better kept in the family until we understand what we're dealing with." Rick's heavy footsteps on the front porch announced his arrival, followed by his usual entrance without knocking. "Ben, where are you? We need to talk." Ben quickly stuffed everything back into the satchel and shoved it under the desk. "In here, Rick." Rick appeared in the doorway of the study, his presence immediately making the room feel smaller. He was a big man who had made his money in construction and wasn't shy about letting people know it. "Kids, why don't you go outside and play? I need to talk to your father." Sarah and Jake exchanged glances but obeyed, though Ben could see they were reluctant to leave the mystery behind. "This has got to stop, Ben," Rick said as soon as the children were out of earshot. "I've been patient, but you're being irresponsible. This place is falling down around your ears. You've got no job, and you're burning through Emma's life insurance money on a pipe dream. It's only been 3 days. 3 days too many. I've got a buyer lined up, someone who'll pay fair market value for the land. You could take that money, move somewhere sensible, and give those kids a real future instead of this fantasy." Ben felt the familiar anger rising in his chest, but this time it was tempered by something else. The satchel under the desk seemed to pulse with possibility, with secrets that might change everything Rick thought he knew about this worthless farm. "I'm not selling, Rick." "Then you're a fool," Rick said, his voice rising. "Emma's dead, Ben. Chasing her childhood fantasies isn't going to bring her back." The words hit Ben like a physical blow, but they also strengthened his resolve. Emma had loved this place, had believed in her grandfather's work, even when no one else did. Maybe it was time someone started believing again. "I said I'm not selling." Rick stared at him for a long moment, then shook his head. "Fine, but when this whole thing falls apart, don't come crying to me for help." After Rick left, Ben sat alone in Emil's study, his hand resting on the hidden satchel. Outside, he could hear Sarah and Jake talking in excited whispers, and he knew they were discussing the discovery. They would want to explore, to follow the maps and search for Emil's mysterious test sites. And despite every practical reason to be cautious, Ben found himself wanting the same thing. For the first time since Emma's death, he felt like he was on the verge of something important, something that could change not just their circumstances, but their understanding of what was possible. He pulled the satchel back out and spread one of the maps on the desk. Tomorrow, they would start looking for Emil's secret garden. The morning sun was just breaking through the oak trees when Ben and the kids set out to follow Emil's maps. Ben had spent half the night studying the hand-drawn diagrams, trying to match the landmarks Emil had sketched with the current state of the property. 40 years of neglect had changed things considerably, but the basic geography remained the same. Sarah carried a canvas bag with some of the plant specimens from the satchel, while Jake had appointed himself the official map reader. Ben brought along a shovel, pruning shears, and a growing sense that they were about to discover something remarkable. "According to this," Jake said, holding the map up and squinting at the morning light, "we need to go past the barn and look for a group of 3 large rocks arranged in a triangle." They walked through the tall grass behind the barn, their legs quickly getting soaked from the dew. The area was even more overgrown than Ben had realized, with volunteer trees and thick brambles creating natural barriers that would have been difficult to penetrate without tools. "There," Sarah pointed ahead to where three moss-covered boulders emerged from the undergrowth, positioned exactly as Emil had drawn them. Just like on the map. Ben felt a chill of excitement. The rocks were placed too deliberately to be natural, and they matched Emil's sketch perfectly. According to the map, they should find evidence of Emil's main research area somewhere nearby. Jake was already pushing through the brambles, following what might once have been a path. "Dad, come look at this." Ben and Sarah hurried after him, using the pruning shears to clear away the worst of the thorny growth. What they found made Ben's breath catch in his throat. Hidden in a natural clearing about 30 feet across was the remains of what had obviously been a carefully planned growing area. Raised beds, now overgrown but still visible, were arranged in precise geometric patterns. An irrigation system made of buried clay pipes was still partially intact, and the remains of what looked like a greenhouse foundation could be seen at the far end of the clearing. But it was the plants themselves that made Ben realize they had found something extraordinary. Growing wild throughout the area were specimens unlike anything Ben had ever seen. There were tomato plants that had somehow survived 40 Oregon winters, their vines thick as tree branches and still producing fruit. Grain plants with seed heads larger than anything he'd seen in agricultural magazines. Root vegetables that seemed to thrive in soil that looked poor and rocky. "This doesn't make sense," Sarah said, kneeling next to one of the tomato plants. "These shouldn't be able to survive here. Tomatoes are annuals. They die when it gets cold." Ben was thinking the same thing. He'd done enough gardening to know that what they were looking at violated basic principles of plant biology. Yet here it was, growing wild and apparently thriving without any human care for decades. Jake had wandered over to what appeared to be a grain crop of some kind. The plants were taller than he was, with seed heads so heavy they bent the stalks over. "Dad, look how big these are, and there are so many of them." Ben examined the grain plants more closely and realized he couldn't identify the variety. They looked like wheat in some ways, but the seed heads were different, larger and denser than any wheat he'd ever seen. The plants themselves seemed more robust, with thicker stalks and deeper root systems. Sarah was taking pictures with her phone and carefully collecting samples. "We need to document everything," she said with the methodical approach that reminded Ben so much of Emma. "If these plants are as unusual as they seem, we'll need evidence." As they spent the morning exploring Emil's hidden research site, a picture began to emerge of work that was far more sophisticated than Ben had imagined. The raised beds were arranged to test different soil conditions. The irrigation system was designed to deliver precise amounts of water to different sections. Even the plant spacing followed patterns that suggested careful experimental design. "Your great-great-grandfather was a scientist," Ben told the children as they sat in the shade of an old apple tree to eat the lunch they'd brought. "This isn't the work of a hobby gardener. This is serious agricultural research." "So why did everyone think he was crazy?" Jake asked, biting into an apple that had come from the very tree they were sitting under. Ben had been wondering the same thing. Based on what they'd found, Emil's work deserved serious attention from the agricultural community. Yet according to the letters in the satchel, he'd been dismissed and discredited. "Sometimes," Ben said carefully, "people aren't ready for new ideas, especially ideas that challenge what they think they know." Sarah was studying one of Emil's botanical drawings, comparing it to the actual plants they'd found. "Dad, look at this." He wasn't just growing different varieties of plants, he was creating entirely new ones. These notes talk about crossbreeding techniques that were way ahead of their time. Ben looked at the notebook Sarah was holding and saw detailed records of hybridization experiments, soil improvement techniques, and yield comparisons that would have impressed modern agricultural researchers. Emil had been documenting his work with scientific precision, recording data that proved his extraordinary claims. As the afternoon wore on, they discovered more evidence of Emil's innovations, a composting system that had created incredibly rich soil even after 40 years of neglect. Water collection and storage methods that had kept the area irrigated long after the main farm had dried up. And everywhere, plants that seemed to defy conventional understanding of what was possible. But it was Jake who made the discovery that would change everything. He had been exploring the far edge of the clearing when he called out, "Hey, there's something buried over here." Ben and Sarah joined him at a spot where the ground was slightly raised and covered with what looked like a metal plate hidden under decades of accumulated leaves and debris. Ben cleared away the organic matter and found a heavy iron cover with a handle, like the lid of a root cellar. When he lifted it, they found themselves looking down into a storage area that Emil had built underground. And what they saw inside made Ben understand why agricultural companies and government agencies had been so interested in Emil's work. The underground chamber was lined with wooden shelves, and those shelves were packed with carefully labeled containers. Hundreds of glass jars filled with seeds, each one marked with detailed information about the variety, harvest date, and experimental conditions. Detailed notebooks wrapped in oiled cloth documented the results of Emil's decades of research. But most importantly, there were maps and photographs showing test sites all over the property where Emil had planted his experimental crops. According to his records, many of those plantings had been designed to naturalize and spread, creating permanent populations of his improved varieties. He didn't just create new plants, Ben said, his voice filled with awe. He seeded the entire property with them. Sarah picked up one of the seed jars and read the label aloud. Drought-resistant wheat hybrid, year 15 trials. Estimated yield increase 400% over standard varieties in low-water conditions. Jake was looking at photographs that showed fields of grain stretching as far as the eye could see, all apparently thriving in conditions that would have killed normal crops. "Dad, if this stuff really works, it would be worth a fortune, wouldn't it?" Ben was beginning to think his 11-year-old son might be right. If Emil had actually succeeded in creating the kinds of improvements his records claimed, they weren't just looking at valuable plants, they were looking at agricultural innovations that could change farming forever. As they walked back to the house that evening, their arms full of samples and documentation, Ben felt something he hadn't experienced since Emma's death. Not just hope, but excitement about the future. Maybe Rick was wrong about this farm being worthless. Maybe Emma had been right to believe in her grandfather's work. Maybe they had just discovered the answer to all their problems. But even as that thought filled him with optimism, Ben couldn't shake the feeling that they were also walking into something much more complicated than they realized. Emil's work had been dismissed and discredited for a reason, and Ben was beginning to suspect that reason might have had more to do with money and power than with science. The question was, would the same forces that had silenced Emil try to silence them? Ben spent the next 3 days reading through Emil's notebooks and trying to make sense of what they had discovered. The more he learned, the more remarkable Emil's work appeared to be. The old botanist hadn't just been experimenting with different varieties of common crop, she had been developing entirely new approaches to agriculture that seemed decades ahead of their time. The seed collection they had found was carefully organized and meticulously documented. Each variety had been developed for specific conditions, some for drought resistance, others for poor soil, still others for extended growing seasons. Emil had even created plants designed to improve soil quality while they grew, fixing nitrogen and adding organic matter that would benefit future crops. What impressed Ben most was the scientific rigor of Emil's approach. Every experiment was carefully controlled, every result meticulously recorded. This wasn't the work of an amateur gardener, this was research that would have impressed university agricultural departments even today. Sarah had become fascinated with the botanical aspects of Emil's work. She spent hours comparing his drawings and notes with modern plant biology textbooks, trying to understand the techniques he had used. "Dad, look at this," she said one morning over breakfast, pointing to a detailed diagram of root systems. He was using grafting and hybridization methods that weren't supposed to be developed until the 1960s. Jake had taken on the job of testing Emil's seeds to see which ones were still viable. They had set up a makeshift greenhouse in what had once been Emil's workshop, using old windows and lumber they found in the barn. To everyone's surprise, many of the seeds that were 40 years old were still capable of germinating. "Look at these," Jake said excitedly, showing Ben a tray of seedlings that had sprouted from Emil's drought-resistant wheat. "They're growing twice as fast as the regular seeds we got from the garden center." Ben was starting to understand why agricultural companies had been interested in Emil's work. If his innovations could be reproduced and scaled up, they could revolutionize farming in regions where water was scarce or soil quality was poor. The potential value was enormous. But their quiet research was interrupted on Thursday morning when Rick showed up again, this time with a man in an expensive suit who introduced himself as David Walsh from Pacific Agricultural Development. "Mr. Carver," Walsh said, shaking Ben's hand with the practiced grip of someone who made his living convincing people to do things they weren't sure they wanted to do. "Your brother-in-law tells me you might be interested in discussing the sale of this property." "I told him I wasn't interested," Ben said, shooting a look at Rick. "Well, that's what we're here to discuss." Walsh continued smoothly. "Pacific Agricultural is always looking for properties with development potential, and this location has some interesting possibilities." Ben noticed that Walsh's eyes were constantly moving, taking in details of the property with the assessing gaze of someone who knew land values. He also noticed that Walsh seemed particularly interested in the area behind the barn where they had been doing their research. "What kind of development are you thinking about?" Ben asked, though he had no intention of selling. "Agricultural research facility," Walsh said. "We're always looking for sites where we can test new farming techniques and crop varieties. A place like this, with its history and varied terrain, could be perfect for our needs." Ben felt a chill at Walsh's words. Did Pacific Agricultural know about Emil's work? Was that why they were interested in the property? "I'm not looking to sell," Ben said firmly. Walsh nodded as if he had expected that response. "I understand. Moving to a new place, getting settled, it's a big adjustment. But I hope you'll keep us in mind if your situation changes. We're prepared to make a very generous offer." After Walsh and Rick left, Ben felt uneasy. The timing of Pacific Agricultural's interest seemed too coincidental. How had they even known about the property? Rick might have contacted them, but something about Walsh's manner suggested he already knew more about the farm than he was letting on. Sarah had been listening from the kitchen and came out as soon as the visitors left. "Dad, did you notice how interested he was in the back area? And when he said agricultural research facility, what if he knows about great-great-grandpa's work?" Ben had been thinking the same thing. It's possible. If Emil was in contact with agricultural companies and universities, there might be records of his research that survived even after he was discredited. That afternoon, Ben decided it was time to reach out for expert help. He called the county extension office and explained that he had inherited a farm with some unusual plant varieties and wanted to have them evaluated. The extension agent, a woman named Dr. Chen, agreed to come out the following week to take a look. Jake had been working in their makeshift greenhouse and came running to the house with news. "Dad, you've got to see this. The tomato plants I started from great-great-grandpa's seeds. They're doing something weird." Ben followed Jake to the greenhouse and saw what had gotten his son so excited. The tomato seedlings that had sprouted from Emil's 40-year-old seeds were not only growing faster than normal varieties, they were also developing in ways that Ben had never seen before. Their root systems were far more extensive, and their leaves had a different shape and color that suggested they might be more efficient at photosynthesis. "It's like they're designed to be better at everything," Jake said. "Stronger roots, bigger leaves, faster growth. How did he do it?" Ben was wondering the same thing. The more they learned about Emil's work, the more it seemed to violate conventional understanding of plant breeding. Creating improvements like these should have taken decades of careful selection and crossbreeding. Yet Emil's records suggested he had achieved remarkable results in just a few years. That evening, as Ben was going through more of Emil's notebooks, he found something that made his blood run cold. Hidden in the back of one of the journals was a letter that Emil had apparently never sent, dated just a few months before his death in 1000 985. The letter was addressed to Emma's grandmother and was clearly meant as a warning. "My dearest Janet, I fear that my work has attracted the wrong kind of attention. Representatives from Midwest Agricultural Corporation visited again today, and their interest in acquiring my research has become more insistent. I have refused their offers, but I suspect they will not accept my refusal indefinitely. I have hidden the most important materials where they cannot be found, and I have made arrangements to ensure that our family will benefit from this work someday, even if I cannot live to see it. If anything happens to me, make sure Emma knows about the special plants. She has always understood their importance, even as a child. The future may depend on keeping this knowledge alive." Ben read the letter 3 times, his hands shaking slightly. Emil hadn't just been discredited by the agricultural establishment, had been threatened. And now, 40 years later, representatives from agricultural companies were showing up at Ben's door, expressing interest in the same property where Emil had done his revolutionary work. Ben thought about Walsh's visit that morning and felt a growing certainty that their quiet investigation into Emils Research was about to become much more complicated. If agricultural corporations had been trying to acquire Emil's work for decades, they weren't likely to give up just because the property had changed hands. He looked out the window at the fields where Emil's experimental plants were still growing wild and realized that he and his children might have inherited much more than just a farm. They might have inherited a scientific treasure that powerful people had been searching for since before Ben was born. The question was, what were they prepared to do to protect it? Dr. Patricia Chen arrived the following Tuesday in a university pickup truck loaded with scientific equipment. Ben had been nervous about showing Emils Research to an outsider, but Sarah had convinced him that they needed expert confirmation of what they had found. Dr. Chen was a small, energetic woman in her 50s who had spent her career studying plant genetics and sustainable agriculture. She listened patiently as Ben explained the discovery, though he could see skepticism in her eyes when he described the age and apparent properties of Emil's plant varieties. 40-year-old seeds that still germinate at high rates would be unusual, she said diplomatically, and perennial tomatoes in Oregon's climate would be, well, let's just say, it would be worth investigating. Ben led her to their makeshift greenhouse first, where Jake proudly showed off the seedlings he had been nurturing. Dr. Chen's skeptical expression changed quickly as she examined the plants more closely. "These root systems are remarkable," she said, gently lifting one of the tomato seedlings to examine its development. "And this leaf structure, I've never seen anything quite like it. The chlorophyll concentration appears to be much higher than normal varieties." Sarah had prepared a detailed presentation of Emil's research methods using his original notebooks and drawings. Dr. Chen spent almost an hour going through the materials, her excitement growing with each page. "This is sophisticated work," she said finally. "Your great-great-grandfather was using hybridization techniques that were cutting edge for his time. Some of these approaches weren't widely adopted until the 1980s. When Ben led her to Emil's original research site behind the barn, Dr. Chen's professional composure gave way to genuine amazement. She spent 2 hours taking samples, photographing specimens, and documenting what she found. The wild tomato plants that had survived 40 winters particularly captured her attention. "I need to run genetic analysis on these samples," she said, carefully labeling collection bags. "But based on what I'm seeing here, your great-great-grandfather may have achieved something truly extraordinary." "What do you mean?" Ben asked. Dr. Chen chose her words carefully. "If these plants really have the properties they appear to have: drought, resistance, soil improvement, extended growing seasons, then we're looking at agricultural innovations that could be worth millions of dollars in commercial development." Ben felt his stomach tighten. "Millions?" "Conservative estimate," Dr. Chen said. "Drought-resistant food crops are among the most sought-after developments in agricultural research. Climate change is making water scarcity a global problem, and any crop varieties that can thrive with minimal irrigation are incredibly valuable. As Dr. Chen packed up her equipment, she made Ben promise to keep the discovery quiet until her analysis was complete. "I'll need about 2 weeks to run the genetic testing and growth trials," she said. "But Mr. Carver, if these results confirm what I suspect, you're going to have a lot of very interested people wanting to talk to you." That night, Ben called his sister Linda in Portland and told her about the discovery. Linda was Emma's older sister and the only family member who had ever shown any interest in the old farm stories. "I remember Emma talking about Uncle Emil's plants," Linda said. "She always insisted they were special, even when the rest of the family thought she was being fanciful. Mom used to get so frustrated with Emma's stories about magic vegetables." "What else do you remember about Emil?" Ben asked. Linda was quiet for a moment. "He died when Emma and I were young, but I remember him being controversial, some kind of dispute with other farmers about his methods. Dad always said Emil claimed too much for his results, that he was more interested in publicity than farming." Ben thought about the letters he'd found, the evidence of Emil being dismissed and discredited. What if he wasn't claiming too much? What if he was telling the truth? "Then," Linda said slowly, "a lot of people are going to want what you've found." The next few days passed quietly, but Ben found himself constantly looking over his shoulder. Every car that drove past the farm made him nervous, and he started keeping Emil's research materials locked in a safe he'd found in the farmhouse basement. Jake had thrown himself into the role of junior botanist, carefully tending Emil's seedlings and documenting their growth. Sarah was researching the historical context of Emil's work, trying to understand why his innovations had been rejected by the agricultural establishment. It was Sarah who made the connection that explained everything. "Dad, look at this," she said, showing Ben a newspaper article she'd found online. "Midwest Agricultural Corporation. That's the company that was pressuring great-great-grandpa, according to his letter. They were acquired by Peterson Seeds in 1987, which was then bought by Pacific Agricultural in 2003. Ben stared at the corporate family tree Sarah had traced. "Pacific Agricultural, that's the company that Walsh works for." "Exactly. The same company that's been trying to get great-great-grandpa's research for 40 years is now trying to buy our farm." The implications were staggering. Pacific Agricultural hadn't just happened to become interested in their property. They had been tracking Emil's work for decades, waiting for an opportunity to acquire it. "They must have known that Emma inherited the farm," Ben said, "and when she died, they saw their chance." Sarah nodded grimly, "Which means they probably know a lot more about what we've found than we realized." That evening, as Ben was working in Emil's study, he heard a car pull into the driveway. Through the window, he saw a black sedan with government plates. 2 men in suits got out and walked to the front door. Ben's heart raced as he quickly hid Emil's materials and went to answer the door. The men introduced themselves as investigators from the Department of Agriculture, and they had questions about unusual agricultural activity that had been reported on the property. "We understand you've been conducting unauthorized plant research," the older investigator said. "We need to inspect your facilities and review any documentation related to experimental crop development." "I'm not conducting any research," Ben said, trying to keep his voice steady. "I'm just trying to get an old farm running again." The investigators didn't believe him. They spent an hour searching the property, clearly looking for evidence of Emil's work. They found the greenhouse Jake had set up, but Ben had moved all the unusual seedlings to a hidden location after Dr. Chen's visit. "Mr. Carver," the younger investigator said as they prepared to leave, "developing new crop varieties without proper permits and oversight is a serious matter. We strongly advise you to contact our office if you discover any research materials or unusual plant specimens." After they left, Ben sat on the front porch with his children, all of them shaken by the visit. "How did they know?" Jake asked. Ben had a sinking feeling he knew the answer. "Someone told them. Someone who wants us to be so intimidated that we'll give up and sell." Sarah was angry. "They can't just come here and threaten us. We haven't done anything wrong." Ben wished he could be sure of that. The more he learned about Emil's work and its potential value, the more he realized they were dealing with forces much larger than a simple property dispute. That night, he made a decision that would change everything. He called Dr. Chen and asked her to accelerate her analysis. If Emil's plants were as valuable as everyone seemed to think, Ben needed to know exactly what he was dealing with. Because one way or another, he suspected their quiet life on the farm was about to end. Dr. Chen called 3 days earlier than expected, her voice tight with excitement and concern. "Mr. Carver, we need to meet, not over the phone and not at the university. Can you come to my home tonight and bring those weather journals you showed me? I think I understand why your great-great-grandfather's work was so revolutionary." Ben drove to Dr. Chen's house in Salem that evening, the precious weather journal hidden under a blanket in his truck. Dr. Chen lived in a modest craftsman bungalow, surrounded by experimental gardens that showcased her own research into sustainable agriculture. She met him at the door with barely contained excitement. "Ben, what your great-great-grandfather accomplished shouldn't have been possible with 1930s technology. The genetic analysis shows modifications that we're only beginning to understand today." In her home office, Dr. Chen had spread out computer printouts, photographs, and comparison charts. "Look at this," she said, pointing to a detailed genetic analysis. "The drought-resistant wheat you found contains genetic markers that enhance water retention at the cellular level. The tomatoes have been modified to extend their growing season through improved cold tolerance. And the soil improvement plants actually increase nitrogen fixation beyond what any known variety can achieve." Ben studied the scientific data, trying to understand the implications. "You're saying Emil created these improvements intentionally?" "I'm saying he created improvements that our best geneticists would struggle to achieve today," Dr. Chen said, "and he did it 70 years before we had the technology to fully understand what he was doing." She pulled out the weather journal Ben had brought and opened it to pages covered with Emil's meticulous climate records. "This is why I needed to see these records. Your great-great-grandfather wasn't just developing drought-resistant crops, she was developing varieties specifically designed to thrive during climate disasters." Ben looked at the journal entries, seeing for the first time the full scope of Emil's vision. Day after day during the Dust Bowl years, Emil had recorded temperature, rainfall, soil conditions, and wind patterns. But he had also documented how his experimental plants performed under increasingly harsh conditions. July 15, 1934, Dr. Chen read aloud. "No rain for 43 days, regional crops failing across 3 counties. Test plot 7, showing continued growth with 30% less water than control group. Hybrid strain A12 appears to be activating deeper root systems in response to drought stress." He was creating plants that could survive climate change, Ben said, the magnitude of Emil's work finally becoming clear. "More than survive," Dr. Chen corrected. "Thrive. And not just survive, drought survive. The kind of extreme weather events that are becoming more common today. Heat waves, extended dry periods, sudden temperature changes. Your great-great-grandfather was essentially designing crops for the climate we're facing now." Dr. Chen showed Ben yield comparisons that made his head spin. In controlled trials, Emil's wheat varieties had produced 3 times the grain of standard varieties while using half the water. His tomatoes had continued producing fruit through temperature ranges that would kill normal plants. His soil improvement crops had actually made poor farmland more fertile while they grew. "The commercial value of this research is staggering," Dr. Chen said. "We're talking about agricultural innovations that could address food security on a global scale, crop varieties that could help feed populations in regions affected by climate change." Ben felt overwhelmed by the implications. Why wasn't this developed? If Emil's work was this important, why was he discredited? Dr. Chen's expression grew troubled. "That's what concerns me. I've been researching the historical record, and there are some disturbing patterns. Emil's work was initially taken very seriously by academic institutions and government agencies. But around 1943, the official attitude changed dramatically. She showed Ben a timeline she had constructed of Emil's interactions with the agricultural establishment. Early letters showed genuine scientific interest and offers of collaboration. But then something changed. Later correspondence becomes dismissive, almost hostile. Emil's research was characterized as unreliable, his results as impossible to replicate. What happened? I think, Dr. Chen said carefully, that Emil's work became too valuable to be allowed to develop independently. If one farmer in Oregon had created agricultural innovations this significant, it would have disrupted the entire commercial seed industry. Ben thought about the corporate representatives who had been pressuring him to sell, the government investigators who had searched his property. So they silenced him. They marginalized him, Dr. Chen corrected, made his work seem unreliable, discredited his methods, isolated him from the scientific community. By the time Emil died, his research had been so thoroughly dismissed that no one took it seriously anymore. Dr. Chen pulled out a folder she had prepared for Ben. I've documented everything I've found: genetic analysis, yield projections, historical research. This represents proof that Emil's innovations are real and reproducible. What do I do with this? Ben asked. That depends, Dr. Chen said, on what you want to accomplish. If you want to honor your great-great-grandfather's legacy and potentially help address global food security, you could work with university researchers to develop these varieties for widespread use. If you want to protect your family's financial future, you could license the technology to agricultural companies. Ben thought about the pressure from Rick and Pacific Agricultural, the threats from government investigators. What if I want to keep control of Emil's work and make sure it's used responsibly? Dr. Chen smiled. Then you're going to need help. This research is too valuable to handle alone and too important to let the wrong people control it. She handed Ben a business card. Dr. James Rodriguez runs an agricultural research foundation focused on sustainable farming and climate adaptation. He specializes in helping small landowners protect and develop valuable plant varieties. I think you should talk to him. As Ben drove home that night, Emil's weather journal on the seat beside him, he felt the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders. He wasn't just dealing with a family inheritance anymore, he was dealing with scientific discoveries that could affect the future of agriculture. The next morning, Ben called Dr. Rodriguez and arranged a meeting. But first, he had a conversation with Sarah and Jake about what they had learned and what choices lay ahead. So great-grandpa really did create magic plants, Jake said when Ben explained Dr. Chen's findings. Not magic, Sarah corrected, though she was clearly as amazed as her brother. Science, really advanced science that was ahead of its time. Ben nodded. The question is, what do we do now? This research belongs to our family, but it's also too important to keep to ourselves. Sarah had been thinking about the same question. Mom always said great-great-grandpa wanted his work to help people. Maybe that's what we should focus on, making sure his discoveries are used to help farmers and feed people, not just make some company rich. Ben felt a surge of pride in his daughter's wisdom. Emma would have said the same thing. That afternoon, as Ben worked in the fields where Emil's extraordinary plants still grew wild, he made his decision. He would fight to protect Emil's legacy, but he would also find a way to share it with the world. He just hoped he was strong enough to handle what came next. Dr. James Rodriguez arrived at the farm on a crisp October morning, driving a hybrid SUV loaded with scientific equipment. Ben had been expecting another university researcher, but Rodriguez was different, younger, more intense, with the kind of focused energy that suggested he was used to working under pressure. Dr. Chen briefed me on your situation, Rodriguez said as Ben led him toward Emil's research site. What you've inherited is more significant than you realize and more dangerous. Ben felt a chill at Rodriguez's choice of words. Dangerous how? Agricultural biotechnology is a multi-billion-dollar industry, Rodriguez explained. When new discoveries threaten existing market structures, powerful interests move to control or suppress them. Your great-great-grandfather learned that the hard way. As they walked through Emil's hidden laboratory, Rodriguez examined everything with the practiced eye of someone who understood both the scientific and commercial implications of agricultural research. He spent nearly an hour studying Emil's documentation, taking careful notes and asking detailed questions about the timeline of events since Ben's discovery. "This is remarkable work," Rodriguez said finally. "But I need to show you something that will explain why you're facing so much pressure." Rodriguez pulled out a tablet and showed Ben a series of corporate documents he had researched. Pacific Agricultural isn't just another farming company. They're a subsidiary of Titan Corporation, one of the largest agricultural biotechnology conglomerates in the world. They control seed patents worth billions of dollars. Ben stared at the corporate structure Rodriguez displayed. Titan Corporation had subsidiaries and partnerships that touched virtually every aspect of modern agriculture: seeds, fertilizers, pesticides, farm equipment, even food processing and distribution. Your great-great-grandfather's research represents a fundamental threat to their business model, Rodriguez continued. If farmers could grow Emil's varieties crops that need less water, improve their own soil, and produce higher yields, they wouldn't need many of the products that Titan sells. The implications hit Ben like a physical blow. Emil hadn't just created better plants, she had created plants that could make much of the modern agricultural industry obsolete. "But that's good, isn't it?" Ben asked. "Better crops that are more sustainable." Rodriguez's expression was grim. "Good for farmers and consumers, yes. Good for the environment, absolutely. But terrible for companies that make their money, selling inputs that farmers would no longer need." Rodriguez showed Ben more documents, internal corporate communications he had obtained through his foundation's research. "Titan has been tracking Emil's research for decades. They know exactly what you've found, and they know what it's worth." Ben felt sick as he read email exchanges between Titan executives discussing strategies for acquiring the Reeves genetic material. The communications made it clear that Titan had been monitoring the property since Emma's death, waiting for the right opportunity to move. "The government investigators who visited you last week," Rodriguez said, "they weren't really from the Department of Agriculture. They were private contractors hired by Titan to assess what you'd discovered." Ben's anger flared. "They lied to us? They had fake credentials?" "Not fake, exactly. But Titan has enough influence in government agencies to arrange unofficial inspections when they need them. It's a common tactic in the industry." Rodriguez pulled out another set of documents that made Ben's blood run cold. "This is what really concerns me. Titan has been quietly acquiring patents related to drought-resistant crops and soil improvement technologies. They're building a legal framework that could allow them to claim ownership of Emil's innovations, even though he developed them decades before their patents were filed. How is that possible? Modern patent law allows for very broad claims on genetic modifications, Rodriguez explained. If Titan can demonstrate that Emil's plants contain genetic markers similar to their patented varieties, they might be able to argue that your great-great-grandfather's work infringes on their intellectual property. Ben felt the walls closing in around him. So even though Emil did this work 70 years ago, they could steal it. They could try. And they have the legal resources to make the fight very expensive for you, even if their claims are ultimately rejected. Rodriguez's tablet chimed with an incoming message, and his expression grew even more serious as he read it. "Ben, we need to move fast. I just received word that Titan is preparing to file a patent application that would specifically cover the genetic modifications found in Emil's crops." "Can they do that?" "If they file first and you can't prove prior discovery, yes. Patent law operates on a first-to-file principle. Emil's work predates their research by decades, but if you don't have his documentation officially registered and protected, Titan could claim they developed these innovations independently." Ben thought about Emil's carefully preserved notebooks, his detailed records of decades of research. "We have proof that Emil developed this technology first. We have proof, but it needs to be legally documented and filed with the appropriate agencies. And we need to do it before Titan files their competing claims. Rodriguez opened a briefcase and pulled out a thick folder of legal documents. I've prepared emergency patent applications for Emils' key innovations. If you sign these, we can file them today and establish legal priority for your family's intellectual property. Ben stared at the documents, feeling overwhelmed by the complexity of what had once seemed like a simple inheritance. What happens if we file these patents? You establish legal ownership of Emils' innovations, Rodriguez said, but you also put yourself into direct conflict with one of the most powerful corporations in the agricultural industry. They will fight back, and they have resources you can't imagine. Sarah and Jake had been listening from the doorway, and now Sarah stepped forward. Dad, what would Mom want us to do? Ben thought about Emma's stories of her grandfather, her belief in his work even when everyone else dismissed it. Emma had always said that Emil's greatest disappointment was seeing his innovation suppressed while people went hungry in other parts of the world. She'd want us to fight, Ben said finally. She'd want Emil's work to be used to help people, not to make some corporation richer. Rodriguez nodded approvingly. Then we need to move immediately. Titan's legal team is probably working on their filings right now. As Ben signed the patent applications, Rodriguez explained the next steps. Filing these documents will buy us time, but it's just the beginning. Titan will challenge our claims, and we'll need to be prepared for a legal battle that could last years. How do we fight a corporation that size? Ben asked. Carefully, Rodriguez said, and with allies. My foundation represents agricultural innovators who are being bullied by corporate giants. We know how these companies operate, and we know how to fight them. Rodriguez handed Ben another business card. This is Sarah Kim, an attorney who specializes in agricultural patent law. She's agreed to represent your family on a contingency basis, which means you won't pay legal fees unless we win. Ben felt a mix of fear and determination as he realized what they were committing to. What are our chances? Better than you might think, Rodriguez said. Emil's documentation is extraordinarily detailed, and his research predates Titan's work by decades. If we can prove that their patents are based on his innovations, we could not only protect your family's rights, but also invalidate some of Titan's existing patents. What does that mean? Rodriguez smiled for the first time since his arrival. It means we might not just be defending Emil's legacy, we might be taking down some of the patents that Titan uses to control farmers around the world. As Rodriguez prepared to leave, he handed Ben a secure phone. Use this for any communication about Emil's research. Assume that your regular phone and internet connections are being monitored. Ben stared at the phone, finally understanding the full scope of what they were facing. This wasn't just about their family farm anymore. It was about challenging an industry that had spent decades consolidating power and suppressing innovation. That evening, as Ben sat with his children on the front porch where Emil and Janet had once carved their initials, he tried to explain what lay ahead. We're going to fight for great-great-grandpa's work, he said. But it's going to be difficult, and it might get dangerous. Jake looked up from the seedling he was tending, one of Emil's tomato plants that continued to thrive despite the approaching winter. Dad, if we don't fight, what happens to the plants? Some big company takes them and makes money from them, Sarah said, and farmers who could really use great-great-grandpa's help never get it. Ben nodded, proud of his children's understanding. That's exactly right. So we fight. As stars appeared in the clear October sky, Ben made a silent promise to Emil's memory. The old botanist's work would not be lost or stolen. It would be protected, developed, and shared with the world, exactly as Emil had intended, even if it meant going to war with Titan Corporation. The legal war began within 48 hours of filing Emil's patent applications. Ben woke up Monday morning to find a team of corporate lawyers on his doorstep, armed with cease and desist orders and accusations of intellectual property theft. Sarah Kim, the attorney Rodriguez had recommended, arrived just in time to prevent Ben from saying anything that could be used against him later. Don't engage with them. Sarah Kim warned as she studied the legal documents. This is intimidation tactics. They're hoping to scare you into settling before the real legal process begins. But the intimidation extended far beyond lawyers. By Wednesday, Ben discovered that his bank had frozen his accounts pending investigation of suspicious financial activity. The local building inspector showed up Thursday morning with orders to condemn the farmhouse due to safety violations that had somehow gone unnoticed for decades. And on Friday, Jake came home from his new school with a black eye and a story about older kids who had been paid to teach the troublemaker a lesson. They're attacking on every front, Sarah Kim explained during an emergency meeting at her office in Portland. Financial pressure, regulatory harassment, physical intimidation. It's a coordinated campaign designed to make you give up. Ben felt the weight of responsibility crushing down on him. He had thought he was protecting his family's inheritance, but now he had put his children in danger. Maybe we should just sell, he said. Take whatever Titan offers and walk away. Dad. No, Sarah said fiercely. Great. Grandpa didn't give up when they pressured him. We can't give up now. Jake nodded agreement, despite the bruises on his face. Besides, if we quit now, all those farmers who need the special plants won't get them. Sarah Kim leaned across her desk. Ben, I need you to understand something. What you've discovered isn't just valuable, it's revolutionary. Emils' drought-resistant crops could help feed populations in regions affected by climate change. His soil improvement varieties could restore farmland that's been damaged by industrial agriculture. We're talking about innovations that could address some of the biggest challenges facing humanity. She pulled out a folder thick with research reports. I've been working with Rodriguez's foundation to document the potential impact of Emils' work. Conservative estimates suggest that widespread adoption of his crop varieties could increase global food production by 20% while reducing water usage by 30%. Ben stared at the numbers, trying to comprehend the magnitude of what his family had inherited. 20%? That's enough to feed an additional 1 billion people, Sarah Kim said. Emil didn't just create better plants, created solutions to world hunger. Rodriguez arrived that afternoon with news that changed everything. Ben, we've made a breakthrough in the historical research. We found Emils' original breeding notes, the ones that document exactly how he created his hybrid varieties. He spread the newly discovered documents across Sarah Kim's conference table. Unlike the materials Ben had found in the farmhouse, these papers contained the complete scientific methodology behind Emils' innovations. Step-by-step procedures for crossbreeding, detailed genetic tracking across multiple generations, and protocols for developing drought resistance that were decades ahead of their time. Where did you find these? Ben asked. University of Oregon Archives, Rodriguez said. Emil donated copies of his research to the Agricultural Library in 1944, apparently as insurance against corporate suppression. The materials were misfiled and forgotten, but they've been there the whole time. Sarah Kim studied the documents with growing excitement. This is the smoking gun we needed. Emils' breeding notes show that he developed these varieties through traditional crossbreeding techniques, not genetic modification. That means Titan's patents, which are based on genetic modification technology, don't apply to Emils' work. What does that mean for us? Ben asked. It means we can prove that Emils' innovations are entirely separate from anything Titan has patented, Rodriguez explained. More importantly, it means we can show that some of Titan's patents are invalid because Emil achieved the same results decades earlier using different methods. Sarah Kim was already making notes for their legal strategy. If we can invalidate key Titan patents, it opens the door for other agricultural researchers to develop competing varieties. It could break Titan's monopoly on drought-resistant crops. Ben felt a surge of hope for the first time in weeks. So we can win this? We can, Sarah Kim said, but we need to move fast. Titan is preparing for a major legal offensive, and they have resources we can't match in a prolonged court battle. Our best chance is to strike first with our evidence and force them into settlement negotiations. Rodriguez pulled out his tablet and showed Ben a timeline he had prepared. Here's what we need to do. First, we file for official recognition of Emils' innovations as prior art, which will block Titan's patent applications. Second, we challenge their existing patents using Emils Research as evidence of prior discovery. Third, we establish a foundation to develop and distribute Emils' varieties to farmers who need them most. A foundation? Ben asked. It's the best way to protect Emils' legacy while ensuring his innovations benefit the people he intended to help, Rodriguez explained. Private ownership of agricultural genetics is what allowed Titan to build their monopoly. Public ownership through a foundation prevents that from happening again. Sarah Kim nodded agreement. Plus, foundation ownership makes it much harder for corporations to acquire the technology through hostile takeovers or legal pressure. Ben thought about Emils' letter to Janet, his warning about corporate interest in his research. Creating a foundation would accomplish exactly what Emil had hoped, for ensuring that his work remained dedicated to helping farmers rather than enriching corporations. What would that mean for my family? Ben asked. You would remain the primary beneficiaries of any licensing revenues, Sarah Kim explained, but the technology itself would be held in trust for public benefit. Think of it as a combination of financial security for your family and protection for Emils' legacy. Rodriguez showed Ben preliminary financial projections that made his head spin. Conservative estimates suggested that licensing Emils' innovations could generate millions of dollars annually in revenue, with the foundation retaining enough to fund ongoing research and development. Your family would be financially secure for generations, Rodriguez said. But more importantly, Emils' work would be used to help farmers around the world adapt to climate change. Ben looked at his children, who had been listening intently to the adult conversation. What do you think? Sarah didn't hesitate. It's what great-great-grandpa would have wanted. His research helping people instead of making some corporation richer. Jake nodded enthusiastically. And we'd still have the farm, right? We could keep growing the special plants. The farm would become the foundation's primary research site. Rodriguez confirmed. You'd be the custodians of Emils' original research area, helping to develop new varieties and teaching other farmers his techniques. Ben felt a deep sense of rightness about the plan. It honored Emils' intentions while protecting his family's future and ensuring his innovations reached the people who needed them most. Let's do it, he said. Sarah Kim immediately began organizing the legal documents they would need to file. This is going to be the biggest agricultural patent case in decades, she warned. Titan will throw everything they have at us. Are you prepared for that kind of fight? Ben thought about Emils' decades of careful research, his frustration at seeing his work suppressed, his hope that someday it would help feed the world. He thought about Emma's unwavering belief in her grandfather's legacy and her dreams of returning to the farm where innovation and tradition could work together. Emil fought this battle for 40 years, Ben said. Emma believed in his work her whole life. I think I can handle a few months of corporate lawyers. Rodriguez smiled and began packing up the historical documents. Then let's make history. It's time to show the world what Emil Reeves really accomplished. As they prepared to leave Sarah Kim's office, Ben's secure phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. We know what you're planning. Last chance to reconsider before this gets unpleasant. Ben showed the message to Sarah Kim, who immediately forwarded it to Rodriguez. Escalating to threats, she said grimly. They're getting desperate. Good, Ben said, surprising himself with his determination. Desperate people make mistakes. That evening, as Ben sat with his children in Emil's study, surrounded by decades of agricultural research, he felt the presence of all the people who had brought them to this moment. Emil, working alone against overwhelming opposition. Janet, preserving his legacy for future generations. Emma, keeping her grandfather's memory alive through stories and unwavering faith. Tomorrow, They would file the legal documents that would challenge one of the most powerful corporations in the world. They would claim their place in a battle that had been fought for decades, armed with nothing but truth, determination, and the revolutionary discoveries of a man who had been dismissed as a dreamer. Ben looked out the window at the fields where Emils' extraordinary plants still grew wild, waiting for their moment to change the world. That moment was finally coming. The courthouse in Portland was packed with reporters, agricultural scientists, and representatives from farming organizations around the world. What had started as a quiet family inheritance dispute had become a landmark case that would determine the future of agricultural innovation. Ben sat at the plaintiff's table, Emils' original breeding notes spread before him, feeling the weight of history on his shoulders. Across the aisle, Titan Corporation's legal team occupied 2 full tables, their expensive suits and coordinated briefcases, a stark contrast to Ben's borrowed jacket and Sarah Kim's practical portfolio. But Ben had learned not to be intimidated by corporate theater. He had something Titan's lawyers didn't have: the truth. Judge Margaret Foster called the court to order, and Sarah Kim rose to present their opening argument. "Your Honor, this case is about more than patents or property rights. It's about whether scientific innovation belongs to the people who create it or to the corporations with enough money to steal it." She walked to the easel where enlarged photographs of Emils' research site were displayed. Emil Reeves spent 40 years developing drought-resistant crops that could help feed the world. He documented his work meticulously, shared his discoveries with academic institutions, and died believing his innovations would someday benefit humanity. Sarah Kim picked up one of Emils' original notebooks. Instead, his work was suppressed, discredited, and eventually forgotten until his great-great-grandson discovered these materials hidden in the family farmhouse. Ben watched the judge's face as Sarah Kim described Emils' research methods, his revolutionary results, and the decades of corporate pressure that had silenced him. Judge Foster was known for her expertise in intellectual property law, and her questions suggested she understood the broader implications of the case. Titan's lead attorney, a woman named Victoria Cross, who had built her reputation destroying patent challenges, rose for her opening statement. "Your Honor, the plaintiffs are asking this court to accept the impossible that an untrained farmer in 1930s Oregon somehow achieved agricultural breakthroughs that our best scientists are only beginning to understand today." Cross moved to her own display, showing charts and graphs that she claimed proved Emils' work was scientifically impossible. The alleged innovations described in these century-old notebooks violate established principles of plant biology. No credible scientist would accept these claims without independent verification. Ben felt his anger rising as Cross dismissed Emils' decades of careful research as agricultural fantasy. But Sarah Kim had warned him that Titan would attack Emils' credibility rather than address the evidence. His success. The first day of testimony focused on the technical aspects of Emils' research. Dr. Chen took the stand to describe her analysis of the plant samples, explaining in detail how Emils' varieties achieved their extraordinary properties. Her testimony was measured and scientific, but Ben could see its impact on the judge and jury. Dr. Reeves' drought-resistant wheat contains genetic modifications that enhance water retention at the cellular level. Dr. Chen explained, these modifications were achieved through traditional crossbreeding techniques that are clearly documented in his research notes. Cross's cross-examination was aggressive, but Dr. Chen held her ground. "You're asking me to believe that a farmer with no formal scientific training could achieve results that PhD geneticists struggle with today," Cross said. "I'm asking you to look at the evidence," Dr. Chen replied calmly. "The plants exist. The documentation exists. The results speak for themselves." On the second day, Rodriguez testified about the historical context of Emils' work, describing how agricultural corporations had systematically suppressed innovations that threatened their business models. His testimony revealed a pattern of corporate behavior that went back decades. Companies like Titan don't want farmers to have access to crops that reduce their need for commercial inputs, Rodriguez explained. Improving plants that require less water, fertilizer, and pesticides are bad for business. Cross objected repeatedly to Rodriguez's testimony, claiming it was irrelevant to the patent dispute. But Judge Foster allowed the testimony to continue, recognizing its importance to understanding why Emils' work had been forgotten. The most powerful moment came when Ben took the stand to describe discovering Emils' research and understanding its significance. He spoke about Emma's stories of her grandfather, her belief in his work despite family skepticism, and her dreams of someday returning to the farm where innovation could flourish. "My wife never forgot her grandfather's teachings," Ben said, his voice steady despite the emotion he felt. "She always said Emils' plants were special, that they could help people. I didn't understand what she meant until I found his research and saw what he had accomplished." Cross's cross-examination focused on Ben's lack of scientific training and his financial motives for challenging Titan's patents. But Ben had spent months preparing for this moment, and he didn't let her shake his resolve. "Miss Cross, I'm not a scientist," Ben admitted, "but I know the difference between helping people and helping corporations. Emils' work was about feeding the world. Your client's patents are about controlling it." Judge Foster called a recess as Cross prepared to present Titan's defense. Ben stepped outside the courthouse into the crisp November air, surrounded by reporters and supporters who had come to witness what the agricultural press was calling the patent case of the century. Sarah Kim joined him on the courthouse steps, her expression cautiously optimistic. "How do you think we're doing?" Ben asked. "Better than I expected," she said, "but Cross is good at what she does. Tomorrow she'll try to tear apart everything we've built." Ben looked at the crowd of farmers, scientists, and activists who had gathered to support their cause. These were people who understood that Emils' innovations represented hope for a more sustainable future. "Let her try," he said. "We have the truth on our side." Titan Corporation's defense began on the third day with a parade of expert witnesses who attempted to discredit Emils' research. Cross had assembled an impressive team of geneticists, agricultural economists, and patent attorneys, all prepared to argue that Emils' innovations were either impossible or irrelevant to modern agriculture. But Sarah Kim had anticipated this strategy. During her cross-examination of Titan's first expert witness, she produced a document that stunned the courtroom. "Dr. Williams," she said to Titan's lead geneticist, "you testified that Emil Reeves' drought-resistant wheat couldn't possibly achieve the yields described in his research notes. Are you familiar with Internal Titan Research Report 47B, dated March 2019? Dr. Williams shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "I'm not sure what document you're referring to." Sarah Kim handed him a thick folder. "This is a Titan research report that describes your company's attempts to recreate Emil Reeves' drought-resistant varieties. Would you please read the conclusion section aloud?" Cross objected, but Judge Foster overruled her. Dr. Williams had no choice but to read from his own company's internal research. "Despite extensive efforts using modern genetic modification techniques, we have been unable to replicate the drought resistance and yield improvements achieved by Dr. Emil Reeves in his 1930s research. His methodologies appear to have produced results that exceed our current capabilities." A murmur ran through the courtroom. Sarah Kim had just proven that Titan not only knew about Emil's work, but had been trying unsuccessfully to copy it for years. "Dr. Williams," Sarah Kim continued, "this report recommends that Titan acquire Emil's original genetic material through alternative means. What did your company mean by that phrase?" "I'm not sure," Dr. Williams stammered. Sarah Kim produced another document. "This is a Titan strategic planning memo from 2020 that specifically mentions monitoring the Reeves family property and preparing to acquire it upon the death of Emma Carver. Were you aware that your company had been tracking my client's family for years?" Cross was on her feet objecting, but the damage was done. Sarah Kim had exposed Titan's long-term campaign to acquire Emils Research through corporate manipulation rather than scientific innovation. The revelation energized Ben's legal team and demoralized Titan's defense. Over the next 2 days, Sarah Kim systematically dismantled Titan's arguments using the company's own internal documents. Research reports, strategic memos, and email exchanges painted a picture of a corporation that had built its agricultural empire on suppressing innovation rather than fostering it. The turning point came when Rodriguez presented evidence that Titan had used similar tactics against other agricultural innovators. "They have a pattern," he testified. "Identify promising research, discredit the researcher, then file their own patents claiming independent discovery. Emils Research wasn't their first victim, he was just their most successful one." Cross fought back with procedural objections and technical challenges, but she couldn't overcome the weight of evidence against her client. Titan's own documents proved they had known about Emils' work for decades and had actively worked to suppress it while developing inferior alternatives they could patent and control. On the final day of testimony, Judge Foster called both legal teams to her chambers for a private conference. When they emerged an hour later, Cross looked defeated, and Sarah Kim was trying to contain her excitement. "Your Honor," Cross announced to the packed courtroom, "Titan Corporation would like to propose a settlement agreement." Ben felt his heart racing as Sarah Kim whispered the terms to him. Titan was prepared to withdraw all their patent challenges, acknowledge Emils' prior discovery of drought-resistant crop varieties, and pay substantial damages for their decades of suppression efforts. More importantly, they would agree to a consent decree that would prevent them from interfering with the development and distribution of Emils' innovations. But the most significant part of the settlement was Titan's agreement to fund the establishment of the Emils Research Agricultural Foundation with an initial endowment of $50 million. The foundation would hold Emils' genetic research in public trust, ensuring it could never be monopolized by corporate interests. "Mr. Carver," Judge Foster asked, "are these settlement terms acceptable to you?" Ben looked at his children, who were sitting in the front row of the courtroom gallery. Sarah gave him an encouraging nod, and Jake flashed a thumbs up. Behind them, Ben could see Dr. Chen, Rodriguez, and dozens of farmers and researchers who had supported their cause. He thought about Emils, working alone in his hidden laboratory, believing his innovations could help feed the world. He thought about Emma, keeping her grandfather's memory alive through decades of family skepticism. He thought about all the farmers around the world who were struggling with drought, poor soil, and climate change, farmers who could benefit from Emils' discoveries. "Yes, Your Honor," Ben said. "These terms are acceptable." Judge Foster signed the settlement agreement, and the courtroom erupted in applause. Ben was immediately surrounded by reporters, supporters, and well-wishers, but he could barely hear them over the sound of his own heartbeat. They had won. Not just the legal case, but the larger battle for Emils' legacy. His research would finally be used for its intended purpose, helping farmers around the world grow food more sustainably and efficiently. Sarah Kim appeared at Ben's side, grinning broadly. "Congratulations," she said. "You just made agricultural history." As Ben walked out of the courthouse with his children, he felt a profound sense of completion. The journey that had begun with discovering an old leather satchel had ended with protecting one of the most important agricultural innovations of the century. But more than that, it had ended with honoring the memory of a man who had been dismissed as a dreamer but had actually been a visionary. Emils' work would finally receive the recognition it deserved, and his dream of helping feed the world would finally become reality. 1 year later, Ben stood in the same spot where he had first discovered Emils' hidden research site, but the landscape around him had been transformed. What had once been an overgrown clearing was now a thriving research facility, with greenhouse complexes, experimental plots, and a modern laboratory building that housed the Emils Research Agricultural Foundation. The November morning was crisp and clear, much like the day when Dr. Chen had first visited to examine Emil's unusual plants. But instead of skepticism and uncertainty, the air now hummed with purposeful activity. Research teams from universities around the world worked alongside local farmers to develop and test Emil's innovations for different climates and growing conditions. Sarah, now 15, and serving as the Foundation's youngest research assistant, emerged from the main greenhouse carrying a tray of seedlings. She had grown 6 inches and gained a confidence that came from knowing her work mattered. Her summer internship with Dr. Chen had convinced her to pursue a career in agricultural science, and several universities were already competing to recruit her, despite her age. "Dad, come look at these," she called, setting down the tray near Emil's original tomato plants. "The Kenya varieties are showing incredible drought resistance. Dr. Kimani thinks they could increase yields in sub-Saharan Africa by 40%. Ben examined the seedlings, still amazed by the practical magic of Emil's genetic work. The Foundation now had breeding programs active on 5 continents, adapting Emil's innovations for local conditions and crops. Farmers in drought-stricken regions of Australia were testing his water-efficient wheat. Agricultural cooperatives in Bangladesh were experimenting with his soil improvement rice varieties. Research stations in Mexico were developing his cold-resistant corn for high-altitude growing. Jake appeared from behind the barn, leading a group of visiting agricultural students on a tour of the property. At 12, he had become the Foundation's unofficial historian, able to recite Emil's story with the passion of someone who truly understood its significance. He was particularly proud of the memorial garden they had created around Emil and Janet's original home site, where the old carved initials still marked the spot where their love story had begun. "And this is where my great-great-grandfather did his most important work," Jake was explaining to the students. "He proved that you could make plants better without hurting the environment. His crops actually made the soil healthier while they grew." Ben smiled as he listened to his son's presentation. Jake had inherited Emma's gift for storytelling, but he combined it with Emil's scientific curiosity. The boy spent his free time developing new experiments, often surprising the Foundation's PhD researchers with his insights. The sound of cars pulling into the driveway announced the arrival of the Foundation's board meeting attendees. Ben walked back toward the renovated farmhouse, which now served as the Foundation's headquarters while maintaining its character as a family home. The old kitchen where Ben had first struggled with the ancient appliances was now a conference room where agricultural policy was shaped. Dr. Rodriguez emerged from his car, followed by Dr. Chen and several other Foundation board members. The quarterly meetings had become important events in the agricultural research community, bringing together scientists, farmers, and policymakers to coordinate the global development of Emil's innovations. "Ben," Rodriguez called, "I have news that I think you'll want to hear." Inside the conference room, Rodriguez spread out documents that made Ben's eyes widen. The Foundation's licensing revenues had exceeded all projections, generating enough income to fund research programs and provide generous royalties to Ben's family. But more importantly, Emil's crop varieties were already making a measurable impact on global food security. "Agricultural adoption rates are unprecedented," Rodriguez reported. "Farmers who try Emil's varieties are reporting yield increases of 20 to 40%, with water usage reductions of up to 50%. We're documenting success stories from every continent." Dr. Chen added her own research update. "We've now genetically mapped all of Emil's original varieties and understand the mechanisms behind their improvements. The applications go far beyond what we initially imagined. His soil improvement techniques could help restore farmland damaged by industrial agriculture." Ben looked around the table at the researchers and farmers who had joined their cause, thinking about how much had changed since that morning when he had first opened Emil's leather satchel. What had started as a desperate attempt to make a new life for his family had become a global movement to transform agriculture. The financial security was more than Ben had ever imagined. The foundation's revenues had eliminated his family's money worries and provided resources for Sarah's and Jake's education that would carry them through graduate school and beyond. But the real reward was seeing Emil's work finally achieving its intended purpose. After the board meeting, Ben walked out to the memorial garden where Emil and Janet's story had begun. The late afternoon sun slanted through the oak trees, casting long shadows across the carefully tended beds where Emil's original plant varieties still grew alongside newer developments. Emma's grave was here now, her headstone bearing the inscription she had requested. She kept the faith. Ben visited every day, updating her on the children's progress and the foundation's successes. He liked to think she could see how her grandfather's legacy was finally flourishing. Sarah and Jake joined him in the garden, a tradition they had maintained through all the changes of the past year. The three of them stood quietly among the plants that had changed their lives, each lost in their own thoughts about the journey that had brought them here. "Do you think great-great-grandpa knew?" Jake asked eventually. "Do you think he knew his work would someday help so many people?" Ben considered the question, thinking about Emil's decades of patient research, his careful documentation, his faith that someday the world would understand what he had accomplished. "I think he hoped," Ben said finally. "I think he worked every day believing that someday someone would understand the value of what he was creating." Sarah picked up one of the new seedlings they were preparing to ship to a research station in Kenya. "Mom always said he was ahead of his time. Maybe he was just planting seeds for the future." As the sun set over the fields where Emil's extraordinary plants continued to grow and spread, Ben felt the deep satisfaction that comes from honoring a promise kept. Emil's work was no longer hidden or forgotten. It was growing in fields around the world, feeding people, healing damaged soil, and proving that one person's vision really could change everything. The farm that everyone had called worthless had become the foundation for agricultural innovations worth hundreds of millions of dollars. But more than that, it had become the place where dreams deferred finally came to fruition, where family legacy and global necessity had found their perfect intersection. Sometimes the most valuable things are hidden in plain sight, waiting for the right person to recognize their worth. Sometimes what looks like an ending is really just the beginning of something extraordinary.